Hello, this is your guideline for filling in the HCR20 version 3 form as part of your risk assessment for the convicted criminal whose case study you're presenting as part of the criminality module. You start off by filling in the boxes at the top. So name is the name of the criminal rather than your name. Record number. In a real life situation, a forensic psychologist in a prison might be carrying out a whole series of reviews with the same prisoner. So they'd need to know, is this review number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. So for your purposes, this can be record number 1. DOB is the date of birth for the criminal. Hopefully you'll be able to find that from books, journal articles, website accounts and so forth. Gender speaks for itself again about the criminal. The nature purpose of the evaluation is for a probation board. Bearing in mind what we said, that even if you're looking at a criminal who's now actually dead, for the sake of the exercise, you're pretending they're alive in order to fill this form in, and pretending they're coming up for probation. So, moving on to the historical scale, H1, H2 and the rest of it. Historical in this context chiefly is about how they behaved before they got arrested and sent to prison for the final time. If you've had someone who's in and out of prison a lot, you're looking at when they're in prison now for this final arrest for whatever their last crime was, so rather than earlier prison accounts. So H1 is their violence history. So where we're looking at the boxes up here, that central box of presence, omit means there is no evidence that you can find, at least, for these issues. There's just no evidence one way or the other. Not for it, not against it. It's just a kind of a gap in the records. So you only tick the omit box if there is a gap in the records. N, you tick to say, no, there is definitely no presence of this issue. So you've looked into it and all the accounts suggest, rather than a gap in the records are well kept, but there's just no suggestion of whichever of the H1, H2, H3, etc. issues you're looking at being a factor. P, possible. So there is a suggestion that something might be going on, but you're not wholly sure what, and you would need to explain the ambiguities, the confusions in the presentation. Yes, there is definite evidence of this thing. In the last box in the right hand column, relevance means having ticked either P or Y, possible or yes. If you tick the no then, or the admit box in the presence column, then the final column is not relevant because it's not there. So it's only if there is a possibility or a yes, definite evidence, that you then move into tick a box in the final column, the relevance column. So if there's no evidence, you tick the omit box. If there is a P or a Y, then you either tick the box for L, low relevance, N, medium relevance, H, high relevance. And that essentially means pretty much what it sounds like. Do you think this factor that you've highlighted is very significant in the risk they pose now, of medium significance in the risk they pose now, or of very high significance in the risk they pose now? And clearly in your presentation, given the limited amount of time you've got to do it, you'll need to mainly focus on where you've ticked the H box, things that have high relevance. That's where you need to give your key attention in your presentation. So we'll go through the boxes. H1, violence. So is there a record of them being violent as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult? Now, pretty much all of them are probably going to have the violent record as an adult, but it's the child and adolescent one you're going to have to dig out in a bit more detail. Again, books, journal articles, websites about them, and so forth. And again, do you consider the level of violence displayed to be significant, highly significant, medium significance, etc.? Other antisocial behaviour, so that's not violence, but other forms of activity they may have engaged in, like vandalising buildings, committing arson, stealing, committing fraud, things of that nature. And again, did they do it as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult? Some of them may have been committing crimes in all three of those age ranges. H3, did they have relationships before getting arrested? So intimate relationships, basically sexual relationships, husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends. The assumption there is of a relatively stable relationship as opposed to a one-night stand the day before they got arrested. Non-intimate, friends, family, children, parents, brothers, sisters, etc. So anything of a non-sexual nature, basically. Employment, did they have a stable employment record, or were they constantly in and out of jobs? Substance use, H5 speaks for itself. Is there any evidence of some kind of addictive drug-using behaviour? That can include legal substances, so if somebody was hooked on prescription painkillers, for example, that would be a factor, or if they were an alcoholic or possibly even a heavy-duty chain smoker, that might be a factor you want to consider, as well as the illicit substances. So H6, the major mental disorders, you'd need to break that down according to whether it's psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, major mood disorders like bipolar disorder, or see other major mental disorders, which is anything else that doesn't fit under either A or B. And again, highlight whether you think it was a big factor or a minor factor, or somewhere in the middle in their behaviour. And this is ideally based on medical records. If you're ticking the P box, then there may not be a medical record, but their behaviour is such that a lot of people during their lifetime as well as afterwards considered the possibility that they were mentally unwell in some manner. Personality disorders, antisocial personality disorder, APD, is the commonly used term for what was once referred to as psychopathic behaviour. So depending on the age of the medical records you're looking at when the crime was committed, they might be diagnosed as either APD or as a psychopath, or possibly as dissocial. They may also have other personality disorders alongside that, because you can get people with multiple disorders, comorbidities, where they've got more than one mental illness at the same time. Traumatic experiences, these are things under H8 which happened to them rather than things which they did to other people. So were they experiencing under A, victimization trauma? That's things that might have happened to them as an adult. So they could have been sexually assaulted as an adult, they could have been beaten up, they could have been in horrendous car crashes, they could have been a soldier in a war zone. All sorts of things might have happened to them as an adult, which you feel could have had a significant impact on their mental stability and the kinds of crimes they went on to engage in. For H8B, adverse child rearing experiences, that's things that happened to them as a child. Were they molested? Were they beaten black and blue? Were they neglected and half-starved? A variety of other possible things that might have happened to them. H9, violent attitudes. Did they appear to enjoy violence and frequently commit violence before going to prison? They might be on record as having advocated violence. They may have a long prison record for various things they've been in and out of prison for before this final crime that got them banged up. H10, did they seek treatment or supervision? That could be therapy, when they were a free citizen in the community, going into psychotherapy, getting medical help and support. If they've been in and out for shorter prison sentences, did they get any treatment, supervision in those shorter prison sentences? And if so, did they respond? In other words, did they go along with it, or did they refuse to turn up? So if they went along with it, you'd be ticking those boxes. If they refused to turn up, then there are other boxes later on to tick. OCH, other considerations, that's down to your discretion. Things you may have read about in the case history that you feel are very, very relevant that don't fit under these other boxes. That's an area obviously you might want to particularly highlight in your presentation. Something you consider very significant to the nature of the crimes they committed and the level of risk they pose now. They may also be things you want to bring in some element of theory on. Likewise, you could say the same about the H8 boxes. If you're looking at trauma they may have experienced, you could bring in theories from Freud, you could bring in theories from people talking about PTSD, various other conditions where horrible experiences in early childhood or indeed adulthood can have a variety of significant impacts later. So that's a good juncture to bring in theory, both in H8 and in OCH. As you're going along in your presentation, if there are boxes that you don't feel are particularly relevant, by all means skip on from them to the next box. So you don't have to mention every single box as you go along. Some of them you can skip if you don't feel that they are particularly relevant to what you're talking about. Now on to the clinical scale, the C1, C2, etc. This is chiefly, and you'll note there it says in brackets, recent problems with ... This is chiefly to do with their behaviour whilst they're in prison now. So again, we said earlier in a previous lesson, if the person you're looking at has been dead for a long time, then look at their prison record, how they were behaving during their years on death row, or just in a prison cell before they died of old age or illness or whatever it was that killed them off. So you're treating them as if they were still alive, and you're looking at their prison record, how they behaved in prison during their final period of confinement. So C1, mental disorder. Were they behaving in a manner that suggested they were mentally unwell whilst in prison? Were they diagnosed, more importantly, with a mental disorder whilst in prison? Violence risk, did they attack anyone? Other prisoners, members of staff, visitors, etc., whilst they were in prison? And you can include self-harm in that, if they were hurting themselves rather than attacking other people necessarily, or possibly they were doing both. Need for treatment. So did the prison authorities recommend this individual for medical assistance and treatment? Now, if you're looking at a case that goes back many, many, many years, then the way people were treated in prisons in the 20s, 30s, 40s, etc., they might well have needed treatment, but particularly if they were awaiting execution, may not have been given it. So you could interpret that they ought to have had treatment, even if there wasn't any actual prescription for it. C2, violent ideation or intent, means did they talk about wanting to commit violence whilst they were in prison? So whether or not they followed through on it, they were at least talking about it, fantasising about hurting people, for example. C3, symptoms of major mental disorders. Similar to the earlier box on the H sections, but again this is to do with how they've behaved and medical diagnoses they've received whilst in prison. So if you tick C1A, mental disorder, this is where you're trying to specify, is it a psychotic disorder, mood disorder, or other major mental disorder. Along with that, C4 talks of instability. So were they exhibiting affective instability, so emotionally their moods, were they up, down, all over the place, or were they very stable or somewhere in the middle? Behavioural, was their behaviour very bizarre, very erratic, very dangerous, or very calm and orderly, or somewhere in the middle? Cognitive, their thought patterns, in as much as it's possible to ever quite establish that. That might be down to therapy notes, interviews they gave to the police, maybe to journalists, maybe to psychological researchers writing books. That may be that you can access letters that they've written to people whilst in prison, which would reflect their cognitive state. C5, treatment or supervision response, is if they were offered treatment or some kind of supervision whilst in prison, did they take it? So compliance means yes, they took it, they behaved themselves, they did as they were told, as opposed to telling the prison doctors to go and do one. Or C5B, responsiveness, if they took up the treatment, did they appear to get any better? Or did they stay the same, or maybe even got worse? And again, OC-C, other considerations, much as earlier, did other stuff happen in prison that you feel is important and worth highlighting that doesn't fit in any of the other boxes that you've been ticking off so far? And again, that's something you might want to give particular focus on in your presentation. Key issues, if they happened at all, that you think are worth noting and linking into a bit of psychological theory. The risk management scale is what likely threat are they going to pose in the future. Now, obviously, as we said, if they're actually dead anyway, then you've got to pretend they're still alive so that there is a future for them to pose a risk in. So R1, professional services and plans. Will they need professional services should they ever get out of prison? So support from probation officers, for example. Or do you feel that they are safe enough to be left to their own devices? Living situation. Do they have family members still alive and around who would allow them to go and live with them? That could be husband or wife, it could be adult children, it could be brothers, sisters, parents, so forth. Or would they be leaving the prison with either no family alive or at least completely estranged family who wouldn't want anything to do with them? Because if they are unable to find accommodation, that puts them in a position of vulnerability. Personal support, that can be things like friends, therapists, church groups or mosque groups, synagogue groups, whatever, that might offer them support if they're a member of communities, or again, they may have nobody to provide them with support. For treatment or supervision response, now this is future, so this is guesswork rather than based on evidence. Do you think they would be compliant? Do you think they would be responsive to probation and therapy, things like drug testing, treatment, anger management programs, etc., in the community after they left prison? And that's a critical issue in whether or not they can be released. Because if you think they would likely be very unresponsive, then it makes it much less likely for them to get released. Whereas if you think there is good reason to suppose they would be responsive, that supports the case for release. R5, stress or coping. So what's the evidence in the past of how they cope with stress, and do you think that pattern from the past will continue to the future? So they get out of prison, they can't get a job, they've got money worries, maybe have an argument with someone. Are they likely to cope with those sorts of stress, or would they erupt into violence or other bad behaviour? And again, OCR, other considerations. Anything else that you might want to factor out. So, for example, if you've got a history of someone with frequent forms of sexual violence to others where it's very compulsive, almost like an addiction in the sense that they don't seem to be able to exercise much control over their sexual manias and obsessions in the past, they'll probably be exactly the same in the future. So you might want to flag that up, those kinds of issues. The bottom box is there, so future violence case prioritisation. If you tick the low box, that means you think they're probably safe. If you tick the moderate box, that means you think they will need a certain amount of probation supervision to keep them safe. If you tick the high box, clearly you don't think they should be let out of prison at all. You think they'll cause mayhem and carnage wherever they go. Serious physical harm, again, that's will they pose serious physical harm to others? So future violence can include things like smashing up property, smashing up buildings, whereas serious physical violence is most definitely assaults on other people. Is there someone they're likely to want to hurt and harm? Low, moderate, high. Imminent violence, so are they likely to go out and attack people at the first opportunity? And that can include sexual violence as well as physical violence. If they've talked about wanting to kill and kill and kill again, that becomes a factor to take into account there. Recommended reassessment dates, well, if this was a real assessment, then you'd be saying it in 6 months' time or a year's time, because this is a form of assessment for your college work, then you don't need to fill in that box. Evaluator is your name, your signature, and the date in which you fill it in. And you can use the printed out version of this as a crib sheet to help you go through the presentation. So you can be referring back to this as a set of notes. Again, whether you do your presentation as a PowerPoint, or you might just want to have a photo of the person uploaded to the screen to give a bit of visual input, and then do it primarily orally, reading out your notes, or do it from memory, which is even better if you can do things from memory, but you're so confident with the case you can talk from the top of your head without needing to just read off a sheet. Even better, that'll get you a higher grade still, because it speaks to confidence, and that's really one of the things that's being looked for. How confident are you with your case and with the psychological theories that relate to it, and any evidence. So in terms of evidence and theories, it may be, we'll go back to R4, treatment or supervision response. If you say, this person might well respond to a particular type of drug rehab therapy, you could then say, according to the research conducted by Professor so-and-so in 2015 or whenever it was, there is a 64% recovery rate for this type of therapy. So in other words, you're not just spouting the first therapy that comes to mind. You've looked into it and you've decided, actually, there is evidence that this type of therapy does work well. If you can include that kind of detail, that's what will get you a higher grade, because you're tying it to real research rather than just, oh, I think he needs a bit of psychotherapy. There you go then. You're drilling down to find information to support your claims. That's what will get you the grade. Hopefully that's answered all, or at least most of your questions in terms of how to fill in the form. If you do have any questions not answered here, we will be covering this in Monday's lecture, and of course you can email in as questions and so on as well. Okay, see you Monday. Take care. Bye bye.